The evening air in Beverly Hills carried that soft, golden hush that only seems to settle over certain corners of the city, just after sunset. Palm trees swayed gently above Rodeo Drive, their fronds whispering against a sky painted in fading pinks and purples. Tourists snapped photos outside designer boutiques, their laughter mingling with the low hum of luxury cars gliding past. It was the kind of place where everything looked polished, expensive, and slightly unreal, like a movie set that never stopped filming. But just outside a quiet, candlelit restaurant tucked between a high-end jeweler and a boutique selling hand-stitched leather goods, a young woman sat alone on a weathered wooden bench. She didn't belong in this scene, not really. Her jeans were faded at the knees, her sweater slightly too big, and her sneakers scuffed from miles of walking. She wasn't looking at the storefronts or checking her phone. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers loosely clasped around a folded piece of paper, and her eyes stayed fixed on the sidewalk, as if counting each crack in the concrete. She'd been there for over an hour. Inside the restaurant, a man finished the last bites of his dinner, grilled fish, a small salad, a glass of water with lemon. He'd come with an old friend, someone he'd known since his early days in the city, back when fame was still a distant rumor and life felt simpler. They'd talked about books, about travel, about nothing important at all. That was the luxury he cherished most, ordinary conversation with someone who saw him as a person, not a headline. When the check came, he paid quietly, left a generous tip, and declined the valet. He preferred to walk. The night was cool, the streets less crowded now, and there was something calming about putting one foot in front of the other without an agenda. As he stepped onto the sidewalk, adjusting the collar of his dark coat, he noticed her. Not because she called out. Not because she stood up or waved. But because of the way she sat, so still, so separate from the flow of people around her. It was the kind of stillness that didn't come from waiting, but from holding something heavy inside. He slowed his pace. Most people would have kept walking. It's easy to assume someone sitting alone is fine or that they want to be left alone. But he'd learned long ago that silence doesn't always mean peace. Sometimes it's the loudest kind of cry. He stopped a few feet away. "Hey," he said softly, not too close, not too loud. Just enough to be heard over the distant hum of traffic. "Are you okay?" She looked up, startled, as if she hadn't expected anyone to speak to her, least of all him. Her eyes widened for a second, then filled with something complicated. Recognition, disbelief, maybe a flicker of fear. She knew who he was, of course. Everyone did. But she didn't gush or reach for her phone. Instead, she swallowed hard and nodded once. "Yeah," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm okay." But her hands tightened around the paper in her lap. He didn't move away. He just stood there patient, giving her space to decide if she wanted to say more. He'd been on the receiving end of kindness from strangers before, back when he was sleeping on couches, working odd jobs, trying to figure out if acting was even possible for someone like him. He remembered how a simple "you good?" from a bus driver or a diner waitress could feel like a lifeline, so he waited. After a long pause, she took a shaky breath. "I didn't mean to. I wasn't waiting for you," she said quickly, as if afraid he'd think she was chasing him. I saw your car pull up earlier. From that old interview you did. The one where you talked about losing people. I recognized it," he nodded slowly. He didn't ask which interview. He didn't need to. There had been many. "I've been sitting here for a while," she continued, her voice gaining a little strength. "Not because I wanted an autograph or a photo. I needed to say thank you. In person, if that's okay." He stepped closer, but not too close, just enough to show he was listening. "Thank you for what?" She looked down at the paper in her hands, then back at him. "For saying the things you said. Back then, when I didn't think I'd make it through the day." There was a raw honesty in her words that cut through the usual celebrity noise. No flattery, no performance, just truth. He sat down on the far end of the bench, giving her room but sharing the space. "Tell me," he said gently. And so she began. It had been 5 years since the accident. Her younger brother, just 17, had been riding home from soccer practice when a distracted driver ran a red light. One moment he was laughing on the phone with her, the next, gone. The kind of sudden, senseless loss that leaves a crater in your chest and makes the world feel like it's moving in slow motion. For months, she couldn't get out of bed, couldn't eat, Couldn't understand how the sun kept rising when everything inside her had stopped. Friends tried to help, but their words felt hollow. He's in a better place. Time heals. You'll get through this. None of it touched the numbness. Then, one night, scrolling through videos at 3 a.m., desperate for anything that didn't feel like silence, she found an old interview. Him sitting in a dimly lit room, speaking quietly about grief, not as something to get over, but as something you carry. He'd said something like, "Grief is love with nowhere to go. So you keep going for them, for yourself, for the love that's still here." Those words didn't fix her, but they made her feel less alone. She started writing letters after that. Letters to her brother, to the universe, to him. Pages and pages filled with anger, confusion, memories, apologies she never got to say. And one letter addressed to him became her anchor. She never mailed it. She didn't think he'd ever read it, but writing it helped her breathe again. "I've carried this one with me for years," she said, holding up the folded paper. "I rewrote it so many times. I wanted you to know that your words mattered, that they saved me when I couldn't save myself." He listened without interrupting. His eyes never left hers. There was no pity in his gaze, only understanding, the kind that comes from having walked through fire yourself. When she finished speaking, the street was quieter now. The tourists had moved on. A street lamp flickered above them, casting long shadows. He didn't offer platitudes. Didn't say, "I know how you feel," even though in many ways he did. Instead, he asked him, "What's your brother's name?" She told him. And for the next few minutes they talked about him, not as a tragedy, but as a person. His laugh. His terrible taste in music. The way he always stole her fries when she wasn't looking. And in that moment, on a bench outside a luxury restaurant in a city full of illusions, something real happened. Not because of fame or fortune, but because two people chose to be human with each other. He didn't know it yet, but this quiet encounter would stay with him longer than any premiere or red carpet. And she didn't know it yet, but this night would be the first step toward finally mailing that letter. Not to him, but to the world in a way that might help someone else feel seen. But for now, under the soft glow of a Beverly Hills evening, they just sat together, two souls briefly touching in the dark, reminding each other that even in a world of noise, kindness still has a voice. The streetlight above them buzzed softly, casting a warm pool of light that made the cool night feel a little less lonely. She hadn't planned to say so much. In fact, she'd rehearsed a dozen short versions of what she might say if she ever saw him. Just a quick thank you, maybe a nod, then walk away before things got awkward. But once she started talking, the words just kept coming, like a dam had cracked open after years of holding back. He didn't interrupt. Didn't check his phone or glance around to see if anyone was watching. He just listened, his posture relaxed, but his attention completely focused on her. That alone felt like a gift. After a quiet moment, he gestured gently toward the folded paper in her hands. "Is that the letter?" She nodded, fingers tracing the creases. "Yeah, I wrote it a few months after. Everything. I kept rewriting it over the years. Every time I felt like I was slipping back into that dark place, I'd pull it out and add something. Something I wished I could have said to my brother, or to you." He didn't ask to read it. He didn't treat it like a souvenir or a curiosity. Instead, he asked, "Do you want to read it? Or just keep holding on to it?" She hesitated. "I don't know. I've never read it out loud to anyone. Not even my parents." "Then you don't have to," he said simply. "But if you want to, I'm here." That small offer, no pressure, no expectation, was enough. She took a slow breath, unfolded the paper with careful hands, and began to read. Her voice trembled at first, but it steadied as she went on. It wasn't a polished speech. It was messy, honest, full of raw emotion. She wrote about how angry she was. At the driver, at the universe, at herself for not picking her brother up that day like she'd promised. She wrote about the guilt of laughing again, of eating a meal without thinking of him, of waking up and forgetting for one terrible second that he was gone. And then she wrote about the interview, the one where he'd spoken so openly about losing his own child, about how grief doesn't end. It just changes shape. "You said something about how love doesn't disappear just because someone's gone," she read aloud, her voice catching, and that hit me so hard, because I was so scared I'd forget him. "But you made me realize—" "I wouldn't. The love was still there. It just had nowhere to go." She paused, blinking back tears. "I started talking to him again after that. Out loud when I was alone. telling him about my day, my dreams, the dumb things that happened. It felt silly at first, but it helped. He nodded slowly. It's not silly. It's how we keep them close. They sat in silence for a while after that, the kind of quiet that doesn't need filling. Cars passed in the distance. A couple walked by, arm in arm, laughing about something. Life kept moving, as it always does, even when your world has stopped. Then he spoke, his voice low and steady. You know, I used to carry letters too. Not ones I wrote, but ones people sent me after everything happened. Some were just a few lines. Others were pages long. People telling me their stories, their pain, how something I said or did gave them a reason to keep going for one more day. He looked at her. I never knew how much those words mattered to them. And I bet you never knew how much yours would matter to me. She looked up, surprised. Mine? Yeah, he said. Because hearing you say that, it reminds me why I try to be honest even when it's hard. Why I still show up even when I don't feel like it. You think you're thanking me, but you're actually giving me something too. She didn't know what to say to that. No one had ever told her that her pain could be a gift to someone else. He shifted slightly on the bench. Do you still talk to him? Your brother? Every night, she said, before I go to sleep. Sometimes I tell him about my day. Sometimes I just say I miss him. And sometimes I ask him for advice. Sounds crazy, right? Not at all, he replied. I do the same thing. She looked at him, really looked at him, not as the actor from movies, but as a person who'd walked through fire and kept walking. There was a quiet strength in him, but also a deep tenderness, like someone who'd learned to hold both sorrow and hope in the same hand. Do you ever feel like you're getting better? She asked softly. Like the grief gets lighter? He thought about it for a long moment. Not lighter exactly, but more familiar, like an old coat you keep wearing because it fits even if it's worn thin. You learn to carry it without falling over, and sometimes on good days you even forget it's there for a little while. She nodded. That made sense. Some days she could go hours without thinking about the accident. Other days a song or a smell would knock her right back to that moment. Grief wasn't linear. It never had been. They talked more after that about small things, ordinary things. She told him she was studying to become a counselor, that she wanted to help others who felt as lost as she once had. He asked about her classes, her favorite books, what made her laugh. He didn't treat her like a fan or a project. He treated her like a person, someone with dreams, fears, and a story worth hearing. At one point, she admitted something she'd never told anyone. Sometimes I feel guilty for being okay. Like if I'm happy, I'm betraying him somehow. He didn't dismiss that. I used to feel that too. Like joy was a betrayal. But then I realized, if the people we love wanted anything for us, it was probably to be happy. To live fully even without them, she let that sink in. It didn't erase the guilt, but it softened it just a little. As the night deepened, the restaurant behind them closed its doors. Staff began turning off lights, stacking chairs. The city grew quieter, more intimate. He glanced at his watch, not because he was in a hurry, but because he knew she probably needed to get home. Can I walk you to the bus stop? Or call you a ride? She hesitated, then nodded. The bus stop is fine. It's just a few blocks away. They stood together, and for the first time all evening, she felt a flicker of something other than sadness. Relief, maybe, or peace. Not because everything was fixed, but because she hadn't been alone in it, not even for a few minutes. As they walked side by side down the quiet street, neither of them spoke much. But the silence between them wasn't empty. It was full of understanding, of shared humanity. He kept his hands in his coat pockets, shoulders relaxed, walking at her pace. Every now and then he'd point out something, a stray cat sleeping under a bush, the way the moon caught the edge of a rooftop, and she'd smile. Really smile for the first time in a long time. When they reached the bus stop, she turned to him. Thank you for listening. For not making me feel weird. He shook his head. Thank you for trusting me with your story. She looked down at the letter in her hands, then slowly folded it back up. I think I'm ready to let this go now. He didn't ask what she meant. He just nodded. Because sometimes the hardest part isn't carrying the pain, it's realizing you don't have to carry it alone. And sometimes all it takes is one quiet conversation on a city bench to remind you that you're still part of the world, even when it feels like you've been left behind. The bus hadn't arrived yet, so they stood together under the dim yellow glow of the shelter's overhead light. The air was cooler now, carrying the faint scent of jasmine from a nearby garden. Neither of them seemed in a rush to end the conversation, even though the night was getting late. There was something about the way they'd connected, no masks, no expectations, that made the ordinary feel sacred. He leaned against the metal frame of the bus stop, hands still tucked in his coat pockets. "You said you're studying to be a counselor," he said after a quiet moment. "That's a hard path. A good one, but hard," she nodded. "Yeah, some days I wonder if I'm strong enough for it, hearing other people's pain. It's heavy." "It is," he agreed. "But you've already lived through your own. That gives you something textbooks can't teach, real understanding." She looked at him surprised. "I never thought of it that way. I always worried my grief would get in the way." "Maybe it won't get in the way," he said gently. "Maybe it'll be the bridge." She let that settle in her chest. For so long she'd seen her grief as a flaw, something broken inside her that needed fixing. But what if it wasn't broken? What if it was just love reshaped by loss? They talked more then, not about pain but about purpose. She told him how she'd started volunteering at a community center last year, helping teens who'd lost siblings or parents. At first she'd been nervous, afraid she'd say the wrong thing. But one girl had looked at her and said, "You get it, don't you?" And in that moment she realized she didn't need perfect words, just presence. He smiled faintly. Presence is more powerful than advice. Most people don't need solutions. They just need to know someone's willing to sit with them in the dark. She thought about that. How many times had she wished during her worst days that someone would just stay? Not fix her, not cheer her up, just stay. "Did anyone do that for you?" she asked softly. "After everything?" He was quiet for a long time. Not the kind of silence that means I don't want to talk, but the kind that comes before something true. "A few people," he finally said. "Not many. Most didn't know what to say, so they said nothing. Or they tried to make it better with cliches. But one friend, he just showed up. Every week. Brought soup, sat on the floor with me, didn't say much, just stayed." His voice was calm, but she heard the weight underneath. She didn't ask for details. She didn't need to. Some losses are too deep for words. Instead, she asked, "Do you ever talk about them?" "The ones you lost?" "Sometimes," he said. "Not to strangers. Not for interviews. But when it feels right, like now, I do. Because forgetting isn't honoring them. Remembering is." She thought of her brother's laugh, the way he'd dance badly in the kitchen just to make her roll her eyes. She hadn't said his name out loud in months. Not because she'd forgotten, but because it hurt too much. But tonight, saying it felt like lighting a candle instead of staring into the dark. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching the empty street. A breeze rustled the palm trees. Somewhere down the block a dog barked. Then he asked, "What's something small he loved?" "Something silly." She smiled without meaning to. He was obsessed with strawberry milk. Like weirdly obsessed. He'd drink it with every meal. Once he tried to convince our mom to let him have it for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. She said no, so he snuck a carton into his backpack and drank it between classes. He chuckled softly. "Sounds like a good kid." He was, she said, her voice thick but steady. He was the kind of person who noticed when someone was having a bad day. He'd do dumb things like leave a silly note in your locker or wear mismatched socks just to make you laugh. He sounds like he left the world better than he found it. She nodded. "I try to do that now. In little ways. Pay for someone's coffee. Listen when a classmate seems off. It's not much, but it feels like keeping his spirit alive." "That's not much, he said. "That's everything." The bus finally appeared in the distance, its headlights cutting through the night. She took a small breath, knowing their time was ending. "I keep thinking I should apologize for taking up your time," she said almost shyly. "But I don't want to because this mattered." "You don't owe me an apology," he said firmly. "And you didn't take anything. You gave something, just by being honest." She looked down at the letter in her hands one last time. Then slowly she tore it in half. Not angrily, gently, like releasing a bird from a cage. She didn't throw it away. She just held the pieces, letting the night air carry the weight a little lighter. He watched her, understanding without needing explanation. When the bus pulled up with a soft hiss of brakes, she turned to him. "I won't tell anyone about this. Not because it's a secret, but because it feels too real to turn into a story for other people." He nodded. "Some moments are just for the people who lived them." She stepped onto the bus, then paused on the bottom step, looking back. "Thank you for seeing me. Not the fan, not the sad girl on the bench, just me." He gave her a small, genuine smile, the kind that reaches the eyes. "You're not hard to see." The bus doors closed, and as it pulled away, she watched him through the window. He didn't wave or pose. He just stood there for a moment, hands in his pockets, looking up at the stars like he was remembering someone too. Back in her apartment later that night, she didn't cry. She sat on her bed, opened her journal, and wrote a new letter. Not to him and not to the past. This one was to herself. "Today," she wrote, "I let someone see my scars. And instead of looking away, he sat with me. Maybe that means I'm not broken. Maybe I'm just healing." Across town, he walked back to his car alone, the city quiet around him. He didn't call anyone or post anything. He just carried the quiet truth of the evening with him, the reminder that even in a world full of noise, real connection still happens. Not on stages or screens, but on benches, at bus stops, in the spaces between words. And though neither of them knew it yet, this night would ripple outward in ways they couldn't imagine, not through fame or headlines, but through the quiet courage to keep showing up, to keep listening, to keep loving even when it hurts, because grief doesn't disappear, but neither does kindness. And sometimes when they meet in the right moment, they help each other breathe again. The days after that night didn't feel dramatically different at first. The sun still rose, classes still started at 8, coffee still tasted bitter without enough sugar. But something had shifted, something quiet and deep like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through places she hadn't expected. She kept thinking about what he'd said. "Maybe your grief won't get in the way. Maybe it'll be the bridge." Those words stayed with her, repeating in her mind like a song she couldn't shake. For years, she'd treated her pain like a secret she needed to hide, something shameful or too heavy for others to carry. But now she wondered, what if it wasn't a burden? What if it was a language? At her counseling practicum the next week, she sat across from a teenager who'd just lost her mother to cancer. The girl barely spoke, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the floor. Most of the other trainees tried gentle questions or offered tissues. But she remembered the bench, the bus stop, the silence that didn't need filling. So instead of pushing, she simply said, "I don't know what to say, but I'm here." The girl looked up surprised. Then slowly she began to talk. Not about her mom's illness, but about how she missed the way her mom used to hum while making pancakes on Sundays. It wasn't a breakthrough, not really, but it was a start. And for the first time, she felt like she wasn't just playing counselor, she was being human. Meanwhile, across the city, he carried the memory of their conversation too. He didn't mention it in interviews or post about it online. He rarely spoke about private moments like that. But during a quiet dinner with an old friend a few nights later, he found himself bringing it up. "I met someone," he said, stirring his tea, "just sitting outside a restaurant. She'd been through something awful, lost her brother young. And she told me that something I'd said years ago helped her keep going." His friend listened, then asked, "How'd that make you feel?" He thought for a moment, humbled, and a little scared, honestly, because you never know how your words land. One careless sentence can hurt, but one honest one, it can be a lifeline. He'd spent years trying to be careful with his words, not because he feared backlash, but because he'd learned how fragile people can be. And now, hearing that something he'd said in passing had anchored someone through their darkest storm, it reminded him why authenticity matters. Back in her world, she started doing something new. Every Sunday evening, she'd light a candle, put on her brother's favorite playlist, mostly upbeat pop songs with terrible lyrics, and write in her journal. Not letters to the past anymore, but notes to the present. Things like, "Today I made someone laugh," or "I cried in the shower and that's okay," or "I wore his old hoodie and it still smells like him a little." She also began volunteering more regularly at the Grief Support Center downtown. Not as a counselor yet, she wasn't certified, but as a listener. She'd sit with kids and teens who'd lost siblings, parents, friends, and she wouldn't try to fix anything. She'd just say, "Tell me about them," and let them talk as long as they needed. One afternoon, a boy about her brother's age sat across from her, twisting a tissue in his hands. "I keep dreaming he's still here," he whispered. "Then I wake up and forget for a second, and it hurts all over again." She didn't offer comfort. She just said, "Yeah, that part never really goes away, does it?" He looked at her, eyes wide. You get it? I do, she said softly. And you're not crazy for feeling that way. He nodded, shoulders relaxing just a little. And in that moment she realized she wasn't just helping him. She was honoring her brother. Every time she made space for someone else's grief, she was keeping his memory alive in the most real way possible. Weeks passed. She stopped carrying the torn pieces of the letter in her bag. She didn't need it anymore. The words were inside her now, not as a plea, but as a promise to live fully, to listen deeply, to never let love go silent just because someone's gone. One evening, she received an email from the support center's director. They were putting together a small booklet of anonymous reflections from volunteers and participants, stories of loss, hope, and healing. Would you consider sharing something? The email asked. She hesitated. Part of her wanted to say no. It felt too personal. But then she remembered the bench, the quiet voice that had said, "Tell me." And she realized maybe her story could be someone else's lifeline, the way his words had been hers. So she wrote. Not the old letter, a new one. Short, honest, full of cracks and light. She wrote about the numbness, the guilt, the slow return to color. She wrote about the stranger on the bench who didn't offer solutions, just presence. And she ended with this: grief doesn't mean you stop loving. It means you learn to love in a different way, with your hands open instead of clenched. She hit send before she could overthink it. A few days later, she got a reply. Thank you. This will help more people than you know. She didn't tell anyone she'd submitted it. Not her parents, not her friends. It wasn't about recognition. It was about connection. Meanwhile, he continued his usual routine. Work, quiet dinners, walks in the hills. But something lingered from that night. He found himself pausing more often to really look at people. The cashier at the grocery store, the woman walking her dog at dawn, the kid waiting for the bus with tired eyes. He'd smile, say hello, ask how they were, and mean it. One morning, while waiting in line for coffee, he saw a young woman sitting alone, staring into her cup like it held answers. He almost walked past. But then he remembered the bench. So he stopped. Rough day? He asked gently. She looked up, startled, then gave a small nod. Just missing someone. He didn't pry. He just said, me too, and bought her a coffee before walking away. It wasn't grand. It wasn't filmed. But it was real, and that's how the ripples spread. Not through speeches or spotlights, but through small acts of seeing, of saying, I'm here, of letting someone know they're not alone in the dark, because healing doesn't happen in a single moment. It happens in 1,000 tiny ones, on benches, at bus stops, over coffee, in journal pages, in the space between I'm fine and actually I'm not. And sometimes, all it takes is one honest conversation to remind us that even in a world that moves too fast, kindness still has time to stop and stay a while. Months passed and life settled into a new kind of rhythm, one that still held space for grief but no longer let it steer the whole ship. She finished her semester, passed her counseling exams, and started seeing clients under supervision at the community center. Most days were ordinary. Coffee in the morning, notes scribbled in margins, long walks home while listening to podcasts or silence. But woven into the routine were small, meaningful threads, like the teenager who finally smiled during their session, or the handwritten note left on her desk that read, You made me feel seen. She never posted about her work online. She didn't share quotes or pose with inspirational signs. Her healing wasn't performative. It was quiet, steady, and deeply personal, and that was enough. One rainy afternoon, she received a package in the mail. No return address, just her name and apartment number in neat handwriting. Inside was a plain brown envelope. Her heart skipped, wondering for a wild second if it was from him. But when she opened it, she found a copy of the support center's new booklet, the one with anonymous stories from people who'd walked through loss and kept walking. Tucked inside was a note from the director. Your piece moved several readers to tears and hope. Thank you for trusting us with your truth. She flipped to her entry, rereading the words she'd written months ago. They still felt honest, still felt hers, but now they belonged to others too. A few days later, a young man came into the center, hesitant and hollow-eyed. He'd lost his sister in a fire. During their first session, he mentioned he'd read the booklet on the bus and couldn't stop thinking about the part that said, Grief doesn't mean you stop loving. It means you learn to love in a different way. He looked at her and asked, "Do you really believe that?" She didn't say yes right away. She thought of the bench, the bus stop, the quiet voice that had asked about her brother's favorite silly habit. "I'm learning too," she said honestly. "Some days it's easier than others." He nodded like that was answer enough. Meanwhile, across the city, he was wrapping up a film shoot. The days had been long, the schedule relentless, but he'd kept one habit. Every Thursday evening, he'd take a walk alone. No phone, no assistant, just him and the streets. It was his way of staying grounded, of remembering the world beyond sets and scripts. One of those walks took him near the same stretch of Rodeo Drive. He didn't plan it that way. But as he passed the restaurant, the same one, still softly lit, still humming with quiet elegance, he slowed. The bench was empty. A young couple sat nearby, sharing fries and laughing. Nothing dramatic, nothing cinematic, but he remembered he didn't stop. He didn't take a photo. He just walked on, hands in his pockets, a small private smile touching his lips. That night, over a simple dinner of pasta and wine, he mentioned the memory to a close friend. "You know," he said, "sometimes the most important moments don't make noise. They just settle in your bones." His friend raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" "Like someone trusting you with their pain. Not because you're famous, but because you're human." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Some things are too tender for retelling. Back in her apartment, she began a new ritual. Every month on the anniversary of her brother's passing, she'd visit the bench, not to mourn, but to honor. She'd bring 2 coffees, sit for a while, and talk to him like he was right there. Sometimes she'd tell him about her week. Sometimes she'd just sit in silence. And sometimes she'd leave 1 coffee on the bench for whoever might need it. A small, wordless offering of kindness passed forward. One such evening, as she stood to leave, an older woman approached, eyeing the untouched cup. "Is this for someone?" She shook her head. "It's for anyone who needs a moment." The woman smiled, eyes glistening. "My son used to do that. Leave coffee for strangers. Said it was his way of saying, 'I see you.'" She took the cup, wrapped her hands around it like it was something precious. "Thank you." They didn't exchange names. They didn't need to. In that brief exchange, 2 lives touched, briefly, gently, meaningfully. Time kept moving. She graduated, got her license, started working full-time at a nonprofit that offered free counseling to teens who couldn't afford therapy. She never became famous, never went viral, but in her small corner of the world she made a difference. One honest conversation at a time, and he kept working, kept showing up, not just on screen but in life. He still gave away his seat on the subway, still remembered the names of crew members' kids, still paused when he saw someone sitting alone just to ask, "You okay?" Once, during a press junket, a reporter asked him, "What's the most meaningful interaction you've ever had with a fan?" He thought for a moment, then said, "I don't think of them as fans, just people. And the most meaningful moments, they're usually quiet, no cameras, no audience. Just 2 humans reminding each other they're not alone." The reporter pressed for a story, but he just smiled and said, "Some things are meant to stay between the people who lived them." And that was that. Years later, she'd sit in her office, sunlight streaming through the window, listening to a young girl talk about losing her dad. When the girl asked, "Will it ever stop hurting?" she didn't offer false comfort. She just said, "The hurt changes, but so do you, and you learn to carry it with love instead of fear." After the session, she'd step outside for air, look up at the sky and whisper, "We're doing okay, kiddo, somewhere. Maybe in another city, maybe just a few blocks away." He'd be doing the same, carrying his own losses, offering his own kindness, living a life that wasn't perfect but was deeply, quietly human. There was no grand finale, no viral video, no dramatic reunion. Just 2 people changed by a single evening, choosing every day to meet the world with open eyes and open hearts. Because real life isn't about headlines. It's about the moments that don't get recorded, the hand on a shoulder, the shared silence, the coffee left on a bench. It's about showing up even when it's hard, listening, even when there are no answers, and believing against all odds that kindness, simple, uncelebrated, everyday kindness is enough to keep the light alive, and in the end, that's the truest kind of legacy. Not being remembered by millions, but being there for one.